to welcome everybody. It's so nice to see all of you again, if only virtually. I would like to welcome Zach and Keith. Keith Stolte wrote the book, Chicago Artist Colonies. Zach, from the Edgar Miller Legacy, is going to help with the presentation, which is going on in the background, and I think we will start that now. So, Zach, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Why don't I'll take over, and then I'll introduce Zach and how he fits in with this, okay? Okay,
Keith, that's good.
Great. Thank you for having us. I mean, I hope this is going to be a fun little session. Well, first let me introduce myself. My name is Keith Stolte. I was an alumni, or I am an alumni of U of C. I took a degree in history, undergraduate. I went to law school, became a lawyer. I now practice intellectual property law litigation. And the genesis of the book is kind of an interesting story. I live in one of the artist colonies that is addressed in the book, called Carl Street Studios. It's on West Burton Place between Wells Street and LaSalle, about roughly a block south of North Avenue. Carl Street Studios used to be on Carl Street, and that's why it was called Carl Street Studios. Carl Street was renamed in 1936 to Burton Place. In 2015, there was a young man who had a trust fund, I think, and wanted to make a little fast money, so he bought a 1890 house on our street. Our street is full of buildings built from the 1870s through the 1890s, that half of them in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s were converted into these art enclaves where artists lived amongst each other. And my building being probably the first, well, it was the first one, and it was the largest one. The young man in question here bought a building right next to Carl Street Studios and intended to demolish the building and built a 3-story sort of Wicker Park 3-flat, and then sell off the units shortly after he built it. And nothing new has been built on the block since 1890. And so people on our block and people in our neighborhood, it's the Old Town neighborhood, banded together and decided to fight, the development of this building, the demolishment of the house next door. And Zach, who works with is the director of the Edgar Miller Legacy, he'll tell you exactly what that is a little later, joined our group, and I, and a woman named Amy Keller, who's at the she's the president of the Chicago Art Deco Society, we decided to write up an application document for the preservation of our block as a historical landmark district. And so we wrote the base document that the landmark committee relied on to ultimately provide us with landmark protection in 2016. So we got this landmarked in record time, because it usually takes several years to get a building. It goes through a whole process, including several meetings with the Landmarks Commission. And what happened there is we were able to get provisional landmark protection within, what was it, Zach, maybe a month and a half, something like that.
Very short time.
Yeah, very short time. And because of provisional protection, that meant that the young developer he got the demolition permit, but he would have had to go to the landmarks committee every time he had changes in plans and every step of the way of building, demolishing and building the new building. And so that was going to put his time frame completely off. So he just threw in the towel, gave up the ghost, and sold the building to a resident on our block. And so we were able to save that building, and we were able to, in the process, landmark this interesting artist district on the near north side. So that's the genesis of the book. I have lived in Carl Street Studios for about 21 years. I had known quite a bit about it. I had researched it, but in the process of putting together the document for the landmarking, we delved into the history of artist colonies, and after that, I just continued researching and at the Newberry, the Art Institute, and collected enough material, I think, for the book, and so that's why I published or wrote the book. Zach, why don't you introduce yourself and the Edgar Miller legacy?
Sure. Yeah, hi everybody. And thanks, Keith, for inviting me to join you tonight, and all of you with the Hyde Park Book Club. My story with Keith's story intertwined, starting in 2015, as he mentioned, with the landmarking of the Burton Place Historic District. But actually, my story with Edgar Miller started at a much younger age. My uncle, Mark Mamelin, was one of Miller's sort of rediscoverers in the 1970s and 80s, who became just totally fascinated by Miller's work and wanted to preserve it and conserve it, and ended up being able to meet Edgar Miller, who was still living at the time and was in his 80s, and befriended him and got to learn a lot about Miller's life. So I grew up knowing this story through my uncle, and then by the, jump forward to the 20-teens, now it was clear that there was just a need for an organization that would start to collect the archives of Edgar Miller, to preserve his work, to advocate for the preservation of the buildings that he did, and the cohort of other artists in these artist colonies that they were a part of. So Edgar Miller Legacy, our mission is to, first and foremost, to preserve Miller's work, to educate about it for Chicagoans and beyond, to become inspired by this great artist. And in doing so, you learn so much about the story of Chicago.
And I will be talking about the first generation of artist colonies, and then Zach will take over a later period, and he'll explain more about who Edgar Miller was. Now, the beginning of the book is a short history of the arts in Chicago between the 1830s and the Columbian Exposition of 1893. There were very few artists in Chicago at that time. Two of note were George Peter Alexander Healy and Leonard Wells Volk. Healy came from Boston, had studied in Paris starting in the 1830s, and had done so well and impressed the French so much that he became sort of the court painter of Louis Philippe during the Restoration. And he became world famous. He was quite famous. And he painted European royalty. He painted prominent French folk. He was sent by the French king to America to paint famous American statesmen and presidents and various other Americans. But he lived in Paris for about 30 years, and in 1855, William Ogden, the mayor of Chicago at that time, visited Paris, had his portrait painted by Healy, and cajoled Healy to come to Chicago. At first, Healy was a little doubtful. He didn't mind visiting, but he ultimately did come, and he took up root for about 17 years, and painted primarily portraits of Chicago's elite. And he was also commissioned by Congress to paint various presidents and for government purchase, and so a lot of Healy's portraits are hung in the White House and the Capitol and the Library of Congress and other government buildings. He's well represented in various museums as well. Leonard Wells Volk was a sculptor that came to Chicago in 1857 at the invitation of Senator Douglas, who was the Douglas part of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And he had Abraham Lincoln sit for him while he was running for president, and he took a life mask. So Volk had the only life mask that Nixon ever gave up. There were death masks later, of course, but so Volk had the life mask of Abraham Lincoln, and they became very useful for other artists as time went on. Anyway, those two artists were really the only artists in Chicago for quite a long time. And Zach, the next slide. Thanks. And I should say that during this period, Chicago's elites were well educated, they were refined, they came from wealth. They were usually the second or third sons who didn't have much to do with the family once the first son was given prominence, and so they moved to Chicago and took up roots in Chicago, became businessmen. They brought paintings, they brought prints, they brought sculptures, but those pieces of art weren't made in Chicago. They were made by East Coast artists and European artists. And to give a sense of how the culture these people were, John Kinsey, Chicago's first white resident, arrived in Chicago in 1803 with his violin. George Alexander White was a chemical manufacturer in Chicago. He developed a huge, very prominent collection of works of art by East Coast and European artists, the most famous of which is this painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. That painting is now very prominently displayed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It takes up an entire wall. It's enormous. That painting was in Chicago. It was displayed in Chicago. It was sold along with the rest of Alexander White's collection before the Chicago fire. So thankfully, all of this art was saved by it being sent away from Chicago. In 1859, there was an art exhibition that was held, sponsored by the Chicago Historical Society. Volk was put in charge of curating this, and this exhibition was not an exhibition of art made by artists in Chicago, except for Volk and Healy mainly. Most of the paintings, there are 320 in total, most of the paintings and the sculptures were conducted or done by European or East Coast artists. There were 12,000 visitors to this exhibition in 1859, which is pretty impressive because the city at the time had a sort of population of 111,000 people. And it was so successful that it was held over for additional months, and then in later years, Chicago art patrons held other similar art exhibitions. But in the meantime, people became more and more interested in art in Chicago. The Art Institute in its earliest form was created in 1866. It changed names several times after that. And then, as you all probably know, in your neighborhood, the World's Columbian Exposition was held in 1893. That building to the right must be familiar to most of, or all of you, that being the Palace of Fine Arts It then became, after the fair, it became the Field Museum, and then it became the Museum of Science and Industry, which it is now. At the fair, there were 8,100 works of art exhibited in that building. There were other works of art exhibited in the various other buildings that were built for the fair, much of which looked like that building in the neoclassical style. Daniel Burnham, who was the head of the fair, favored for this fair and for other purposes later on the Beaux-Arts classical style, and so the buildings that were, most of the buildings that were built, as most of you probably know, look like that or other classical renditions. Of the 8,100 works of art, 2,500 were created by by Americans. Some of the artists that had created those works were Singer Sargent, William Merritt Chase, Winslow Homer, some of the best and greatest artists that America ever had. And of the 450 American painters represented among that 8,100 works of art, there were about 150 that came from New York and only 20 that came from Chicago. So Chicago was not very well attended in terms of the artists contributing works to this fair, because still by 1893 there weren't all that many artists in Chicago. Chicago artists contributed about 27 paintings to the fair, and that was 2 less than 2 East Coast painters combined. Winslow Homer and George Inness combined contributed 29 paintings. So that gives you a sense of where Chicago artists, what place they occupied at this time in American artistic history. So the next slide. 27 million people visited the fair, which is pretty impressive given our US population was roughly 100 million. Now, some people came from overseas, but most of the visitors were from the United States. This is the first time that Americans saw art on the scale. America and even Europe didn't have art museums on the scale that we have today. And 81,000 pieces of art in one building would have been a first for anyone pretty much on the planet. I think maybe the Vatican might challenge me on that, but most people couldn't get into the Vatican to view the art that the Vatican had at that time. And so there's a growing tension over the years, starting here in the 1890s, between classicists, traditional Western art, and modernists. And the building to the right, upper right, is Louis Sullivan's transportation building. This building stuck out at the fair because it was a fairly early modernistic architectural rendering. And it really does, as you can see, compared to the Palace of Fine Arts that we saw in the previous slide, you can see quite a difference in what expression is being conducted through art architecture here. It's much more boxy. It has modernist designs, geometrical designs, and it really did stick out. It was the front section that you see most prominently there was yellow. Most of the other buildings of the fair were white. And this tension starts with the fair, with Louis Sullivan sort of criticizing the Beaux-Arts style of the buildings of the fair and claiming that Daniel Burnham's choice on the neoclassical style would set architecture back about 40 years, which kind of happened. Not exclusively, but modernism was a tough go in its earliest days because, in part because of the fair. Next slide. What is an artist colony? I think, people could debate this, but for decades, going back into the 1830s in France, artists of different types of sculptors, different venues, painters, actors, musicians, tended to congregate in geographically small areas. In this case, on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see a building that is the 10th Avenue, I'm sorry, 10th Street studio building that was built in New York in 1857. And this was the first American building devoted strictly for artists to live and work. And basically a collective of artists who can borrow from the multidisciplinary mishmash and benefit from ideas that they exchange, through collaboration and conversation and just being together. Next slide. The very first artist colony in Chicago was the Tree Studios, which many of you may be familiar with. It's on State Street between Ohio and Ontario. Judge Lambert Tree and his wife, Anna, who was an artist herself, decided to build the Tree Studios after the fair. There were a lot of artists that came to the fair to help create the buildings and decorate the buildings, including the sculptures that were throughout the fair grounds. And Anna and her husband, Lambert, decided that they wanted to create a residential and work residence space for artists who came to the fair, and they wanted to keep them in Chicago. So they built this wonderful building, Queen Anne style building, in 1894. It was finished in 1895. Has 35 studios, and later on in 1912, there was an annex built on Ohio, and in 1913, and another annex built on Ontario. And these created additional, 8 additional large apartments. These were always very much in demand by apartment and by artists, all the way through 2006, when it was emptied of the artists. The folks that purchased the building wanted to get away from this being a pure artist colony and made it into a more general office space. So unfortunately, it's no longer an art colony, although there are interesting shops in the building, and it has been preserved as a landmark. The units were inexpensive. The ground floor was rented out for commercial purposes to help defray the costs of the building, to keep the rents inexpensive. But the units themselves were quite elegant, especially the ones which were built in the annexes. There were large two-bedroom spaces, and there have been several generations of artists that occupied the Tree Studios, including Frederick Milton Grant, which I'll talk about later, Boris Annisfeld, who painted, very significant painter, taught at the Art Institute, painted backdrops for the Ballet Russes. Pauline Palmer, very significant artist at the time. And Peter Falk and Burgess Meredith had spent some time in the Tree Studios much later. Next slide. Pauline Palmer had a huge pedigree, wonderful pedigree, educational pedigree. She went to Paris and studied at 3 or 4 different academies. She showed at the Paris Salon in 1905, 06, 07, and 1911. She was very popular in Chicago. She was popular elsewhere throughout the United States. She won a lot of awards at the Art Institute and elsewhere in other museums throughout the country. She was very popular between 1910 and 1930, and then her modernism was moving in and shoving out traditional impressionist painters, and she became less and less of a known quantity. And she is pretty much not known at all today, which is unfortunate because she was a shining star in American art, and especially here in Chicago. Next slide. Another huge Chicago artist who lived in the Tree Studios was Frederick Milton Grant, whose canal scene is shown on the right. He too had a big pedigree. He studied with William Merritt Chase, Jonas Lai, Alphonse Mucha, several other very prominent art teachers, and he won virtually every prize that you could win at the Art Institute during the annual American Art and Chicago and Vicinity annual exhibitions. He lived in several artist studios that we talk about in the book, and I just wanted to share with you some of the prominent artists that lived in the Tree Studios. Next slide. All right, so the Fine Arts Building started life as the Studebaker showroom. Studebaker started off, before they went into cars, they made wagons, and so they built this building in 1885, and this building was where they built wagons and also showcased their wagons. In 1889, they outgrew that building. They moved to some building on Wabash, and decided to make this into an arts building. So they rented space to art organizations, artists themselves, and the 10th floor was several of the top artists of the 1890s and 1910s, such as Oliver Dennett Grover, Ralph Clarkson, and Loretto Taft, who you probably know from his own studio in your neighborhood. Harriet Monroe founded Poetry magazine there. It's still going strong today. Not there, in a new building that they built several years ago. Margaret Anderson created the Little Review, which was a very prominent avant-garde modernist art journal that was very influential from its founding in 1914 to 1930, when it became defunct as a result of the Depression. Frank Lloyd Wright and Dwight Perkins, very prominent architects, had offices there. This building housed hundreds of artists or art-related organizations. Next slide. Here's the leading artists of Chicago in the 1890s. The gentleman on the left is Oliver Dennett Grover. The man in the middle is Loretto Taft, the sculptor. And the man at the right is Ralph Clarkson, and the man seated is Charles Francis Brown. These gentlemen dominated the art scene in Chicago for 25, 30 years. They reflected the highest Western art traditions. They were classicists, and they did not like modernism, and they fought the advent of modernism in Chicago for a long time, and they successfully kept it at bay for some time, at least through the early 1930s, when they either died or their own art was becoming less and less popular. Next slide. In the Fine Arts Building was the Little Room, which was a group of people, mainly artists, architects, musicians, writers, who met every Friday afternoon in the 10th floor studio of Clarkson's studio at the top of the Fine Arts Building. Here they're dressed up in this photograph here. They're doing a dramatic production. They were a fun group of people. They met every Friday to converse, to have poetry readings, to have dramatic skits. They had occasional dances, and Isadora Duncan would pop in and dance with Irving Kane Pond, a very prominent architect at the time, who would do somersaults in his 80s. And very interesting man, wrote a wonderful autobiography that wasn't published until the 2000s. It was in his papers, and it's a delightful, very lengthy autobiography that's very, very honest and gives a scathing portrait of some of the people that he might not have published had he been able to filter it before it was published. The Cliff Dwellers, another prominent social group club, was founded in that building, and it subsequently later moved to the top of the Symphony Hall. Next slide. 57th Street Artist Studios, which some of you may recall, they were built as concessions in 1892 in anticipation of the fair at the northwestern entrance of the fair. They were basically storefronts with windows, and they're roughly 60 feet by 20. And after they were used as concession kiosks at the fair, they sat dormant and vacant for several years. And then Thorsten Veblen, who is a fellow at the University of Chicago, an economist, sociologist, he sort of took up residence in one of these units, and other artists started moving into these units, and including Bror Nordfeldt, who was a fellow Norwegian. Charles Francis Brown, who is the gentleman sitting in the previous photograph, he took in digs. These were very, very cheap, about $350 today's dollars a month, and they were basically very simple. They didn't have heat, so you'd have to provide your own heat. They had a privy in the back, sort of not the courtyard, but it was in the backyard, I guess. And they artists occupied these. Next slide. Artists occupied these. There's these units until the 1960s, when they were torn down as a result of urban renewal. Floyd Dell is pictured on the right. That's a portrait of Floyd Dell by Nordfeldt. He moved in, and he and his wife moved in and decided that they would experiment with free love, and that didn't work out very well for them, and their marriage didn't last very long. But in the meantime, they did have salons where they invited Margaret Anderson of the Little Review, and Edgar Lee Masters, and Ben Hecht, and Sherwood Anderson, some of the most prominent writers of the day nationally, and so that made for a very interesting conversation, I'm sure. Catherine Dunham, an African-American dancer, had a studio on Michigan Avenue, and was more or less forced out of the building because, white occupants of Michigan Avenue didn't like African-American artists and dancers coming into their area, and so she took up digs in the 57th Street Artist Colony, and was there for quite a long time. She ultimately won National Medal of the Arts and was an honoree at the Kennedy Center in the 80s. In 1963, they were demolished. I was told that not all of them were demolished. Someone had remembered, at least until the early 80s, that some of those buildings still remain. I was in Hyde Park in 1982. I don't recall any of those buildings, but But be that as it may, they ceased to be artist studios in the early 60s. Next slide. Next slide. Midway Studios, which you may be familiar with, is located on the south of 60th Street, south of the Midway Plaisance. Taft had tired of the Fine Arts Building. He needed a bigger space because the sculptures that he worked on were enormous. As you probably all know, at the end of the western edge of the Midway is Taft's Fountain of Time, which is about 110 feet long. So he needed huge spaces for huge sculptures, and so he created Midway Studios in that space. And his fellow sculptor, Nellie Walker, who in this photograph is the woman at the far right, sitting next to Taft, she took up digs along with him in this Midway Studios. At the other end of the Midway, Taft had planned to have another equally monumental sculpture called the Fountain of Creation, but he couldn't get funding for that, and so that never happened. And now I believe there's a large sculpture of a Renaissance horseman done by Alban Classic, I think. Next slide. There's Taft and some apprentices working on the Fountain of Time in Midway Studios. Next slide. Taft and the several of the primary artists of the Fine Arts Building and the Little Room crowd, these were Chicago's most successful artists, and so they had the means to leave Chicago, create an artist colony out near the Rock River in Oregon, Illinois. And they at first they lived in tents, and then they built little cottages, and some are not so little. Taft's cottage was quite large, and Taft developed and designed the Black Hawk statue that you see here that dominates the bank over the eastern bank of the Rock River and looks out over the river. And you can see this sculpture. It's about 60 feet high. You can see this sculpture from several miles away. It's quite impressive as you first encounter it on the roads nearby. It was an artist colony until 1942, when the last when it was created in 1898. There was a lease drawn, and the lease was that the artists, there are about 15 of them, they had to pay $1 and provide local art lectures or provide artwork to the local community in Oregon, and they could have these 13 acres. And the last lessee was, the last person who was part of the lease was Clarkson. He died in 1942, and so it ceased to be an artist colony. It now is occupied by Northern Illinois University, and still has some of the buildings there, and that statue is still there too. Next slide. The photograph, or I'm sorry, the drawing at the top is a Irving Kane Pond drawing of one of the cottages that were planned for the Eagle's Nest. I don't think that was ever built though. And the lower photograph is of the Oxbow. There was a second bucolic colony called the Oxbow, and Walter Clute and Frederick Fersman created that in about 1906, I believe. And that was another, that still is an art colony that still hosts summer students from the university, from the Art Institute. And those are the old original first generation artist colonies. And Zach, I turn it over to you to talk about Towertown and the Burton Place artist colonies.
Thanks, Keith. Very interesting history of Chicago's artist colonies and how they got started. I think things really took a turn for Chicago and artists in Chicago after the turn of the 20th century. I think one of the themes we got from your portion was that, you know, in the early stages of Chicago, there was a lot of emphasis on classically trained artists and elite, you know, citizens driving the creation of that art. By the 19-teens, though, the city, of course, was booming, and more people were moving to the city, you know, by the millions by the 19-teens. And neighborhoods had come to develop where artists would simply, you know, set up camp and find a place to live, who weren't necessarily, you know, artists who were going to the Paris salons or, you know, anywhere well known, but more were just artists who were from sort of the hinterlands of the United States, who were coming to Chicago to try to find opportunity. And one of the neighborhoods that developed in the early teens was known as Towertown, which many of you know this neighborhood now, but it certainly is not Towertown anymore. It's the Magnificent Mile, like a water tower. But at the time, it was actually a fairly affluent neighborhood that had sort of become less affluent and divided up, and was a good place for artists to move into for affordable rents. And it was right near the lake and the inner city. So it was a really great place for artists. And in many ways, it rivaled New York City's Greenwich Village in that period, and was just as well known. For instance, Floyd Dell, who Keith mentioned earlier, got his start in Chicago in Towertown, and later went to New York City, I think by the late 19-teens and 1920s, where he ran all kinds of literary magazines and was an editor. As I mentioned, the neighborhood had been subdivided into smaller apartments, which made it a great place for young people. And also, this was a place that did grow out of the Tree Studios, founded in 1894. And it's not clear exactly whether the neighborhood by 1894 was becoming an artistic neighborhood, and that's why the Trees decided to set the art studio there, or whether the neighborhood sort of, it was probably all happening generally around the same time after the World Columbian Exposition. Now this neighborhood in Towertown became known as Little Bohemia, and as I mentioned, was full of artists and writers, women choosing not to get married. That, of course, means that in that day's society, if you weren't getting married as a woman, that was seen as not acceptable. And for many women who wanted to live an independent lifestyle, they had to become an artist or, you know, take on another profession. And many of them ended up living in this neighborhood. And many other countercultural subcultures flocked to this district. And everything that you would think that would come from so many artists living in the same neighborhood came: bars, cafes, theaters, jazz clubs such as Burt Kelly's, which was on the previous slide, bookstores and lounges. Now, we all know that Prohibition in the 20s happened all over the country, and in Chicago in particular caused a lot of interesting outcomes. In this neighborhood, of course, everyone in this neighborhood enjoyed drinking and socializing. And so in a lot of cases, tea rooms were set up where, of course, they would serve you, you know, prohibited alcohol in teacups, so it looked like everybody was following the law. But it was that kind of neighborhood. It was just sort of a very edgy neighborhood that was not interested in sort of puritanical ideas that were going on by the 1920s. And also in this time, there were, of course, many famous or soon to be famous writers and thinkers gathering around the area, especially Washington Square Park, which was known as Bughouse Square colloquially, which was in front of the Newberry Library. They actually still continue to do a Bughouse Square debates every year now here today. So they carried on the tradition, but they talked about all kinds of ideas that, we might think of ideas that, women's suffrage we know was a big deal at that time, but they were dealing with other topics like institutional racism, homophobia, socialism and unionism, all in this neighborhood at that time. And we sort of forget or write off that period because obviously it didn't really have a resurgence until much later in the mid-20th century. Another place, the Dill Pickle Club, you may have heard of before, was sort of the indoor venue that carried most of that outdoor energy inside year-round. I believe the entrance, which is a tiny little picture there, was in a back alley, and I think the door said, "Danger, step low, stoop high, leave your dignity outside." So, of course, Keith's mentioned a lot of famous artists and writers who were in the Hyde Park art colony area, as well as the Fine Arts Building. Many of these folks also spent plenty of time in Towertown. Just some of them mentioned there: Carl Sandburg, Dreiser, Harriet Monroe, as we mentioned before. And then others you might not think of, like Clarence Darrow, the lawyer, Emma Goldman, who was a radical anarchist and organizer at that time, Kenneth Rexroth, a poet. And then, one of the most prominent stories to come out that we're learning more and more about is the story of Edgar Miller, Saul Kogen, and other artists that were around this cohort that really embodied this shift in Chicago's art scene and carried through this artist colony idea into the 1920s and 30s. They were a big part of the Chicago artistic renaissance, which we're coming now to learn more about since it was in many ways sort of passed over by history. Now, many artists, as I mentioned, were coming to Chicago for work and also to attend the School of the Art Institute, which was, then as now, a center of art education in this country. And for someone like Edgar Miller, who was born in Idaho Falls, Idaho, really at the western frontier of the country, it was a place that he could easily get to attend, rather than, the sort of ideal of the day was that you would get sent to Paris or Rome to study. But this idea of getting classical training was really starting to fall out of fashion. And the Art Institute was seen as a totally valid alternative within the borders of the United States. So Edgar Miller arrived in Chicago in 1917 and started taking classes there. Saul Kogen was actually a Chicago native, born to Russian Jewish immigrants, but wanted to become an artist as well, and took classes at the Hull House, which was nearby where he grew up. And these two became friends at the school and really got along. They both were thinking about the advent of modern and avant-garde art at that period, and wanting to take Chicago in this modernist direction. And actually they decided to leave the school because they didn't feel like they were getting the education that they desired there, and actually spent some time in 1920, I believe, at the Hull House under the auspices of Jane Addams, and both referred to her as a mentor later in their lives. Now, I should have mentioned Edgar Miller, by the late teens, was a prolific genius artist. He could work in already many different mediums, including painting, drawing, sculpture, and he had a knack for materials such that he wanted to try everything and learn how to do every type of art that he could. He really wanted to be what we might call a Renaissance man of the modern era. And so this is important to note because Saul, he traveled to Paris around 1925 and was enchanted by the Parisian-style art colonies there in Montmartre and the left bank. And Miller, during this time, is spending a lot of time in Towertown. He starts his own gallery and studio called the House at the End of the Street, which was this barn at the end of Pearson. So literally the house at the end of the street. And he was also working at the Iannelli Studios and doing private commissions. But he really became known in that neighborhood as sort of a magic worker to do interior design for friends' apartments, for businesses and restaurants, and even started getting, more well-known commercial projects. Like I said, with Iannelli, he did work for Howard Van Doren Shaw, some stained glass work for him. And so when Kogen returned, he remembered Miller. He wanted to build this, he wanted to bring this idea of sort of arts and crafts, modern art colonies to Chicago. And he knew that Miller was the right person to tap for helping to build these. And Miller was such a genuine spirit. He really wanted to make art without care so much for credit or even payment sometimes. And so in a way, it was an experiment. They both considered it sort of a social experiment to build artist colonies for and by artists. Now, the city's gentrification helped to spur this on because that Towertown neighborhood was becoming gentrified by the 1920s. And so it was a perfect time for them to set up shop just nearby, where Keith mentioned he is now at the Carl Street Studios on West Burton Place. But at the time, it was about a mile away, half mile to a mile away from Towertown, and really in a neighborhood that wasn't that well known to any of these artists. It was a working class German Armenian neighborhood. And much of the housing stock was built in the 1870s and 1880s after the fire, and was starting to deteriorate and become affordable for someone like Kogen to purchase and then hire his artist friends like Edgar Miller. This is actually the invitation that Edgar Miller made for all the guests that were invited to the opening of the Carl Street Studios in 1927. And I imagine hundreds were invited, maybe thousands. Well, we don't really know that information, but some of the featured artists, you notice John Norton, the great muralist of Chicago, and others like Edgar Britton and Margaret Otway were featured at the opening at 155 Carl Street, as Keith mentioned, was called Carl Street at the time. Now, the studios on Carl Street really flourished, as I mentioned, because it was sort of the perfect storm where artists were moving out of Towertown, and this was a really cool place to live, because it was like living in a piece of art, surrounded by art, an enclave with walls, and the interiors, as you can see, were completely decked out in tile, metalwork, stained glass, really creative sort of arts and crafts meets modernism, a lot of Mexican and Native American influences. So for many artists, it was just a sort of paradise where they could come and be surrounded by art. And many of these artists did travel between what was remaining in Towertown, as well as the Hyde Park neighborhood, where there was the other major enclave of artists. But just another example of some of the artists that either worked or resided or visited the Carl Street Studios in the late 20s and early 30s. You know, obviously Edgar, but his brother and sister Frank helped him. Jesus Torres, who was a remarkable Mexican immigrant craftsman who was Edgar Miller's apprentice for all these years. Residents like the Russian ballet teacher and dancer Adolf Bohm, Boris Anisfeld, who Keith mentioned earlier, a Russian painter and set designer, and later into the 50s and 60s, other artists that you might recognize like Mark Tobey and Roger Ebert lived in the studios. In the 30s, or this might have been in 1929 or 1930, around the time that they were visiting the US to do murals for New York City and Detroit, Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo came to the studios, most likely through the connections Miller and Kogen had with the Hull House. And then, of course, Tallulah Bankhead, famous movie star of the silent screen, who had many a nice party at the Carl Street Studios at that time. So it was a real nexus for a lot of different artistic cultures in that period. Now this scene, which became known as sort of the handmade studios by Edgar Miller and Saul Kogen, attracted just this really diverse, thriving scene of artists, designers, architects, playwrights, actors, many more. And as I mentioned, this energy from Towertown really shifted to Old Town and to Hyde Park. And within 20 years, the idea of this neighborhood called Old Town really emerged, especially with the founding of the Old Town Art Fair, which was based on these impromptu art fairs that were going on around the neighborhood for many years as the artists just flocked into this neighborhood. And then over time, Miller and Kogen's aesthetic of using recycled building materials and having artists live on site in these kind of art colony situations spread around the neighborhood, and many more buildings were lived in and worked in by artists and added to by the artists themselves, which gives this whole neighborhood of Old Town a really arts and crafts look that many don't quite understand why that happened, because certainly today a lot of the artists have unfortunately left. But just some examples of how Old Town Lincoln Park really grew into an artist, kind of a wide-ranging artist colony neighborhood. Clive Rickabaugh, who was a playwright and also sort of an environmental interior environment designer, founded some other art colonies, one right across from the Carl Street Studios on Burton Place, and one up in Lincoln Park on Hudson. And for those of you who are familiar with someone, Henry Darger, who was really, he's considered a so-called outsider artist. He wasn't going for professional acclaim in his lifetime, but he was living at West Webster in Lincoln Park by 1932. So it just gives you an idea of this was really becoming an artistic neighborhood all the way through the 1970s, when later artists like Roger Brown, the Imagist, set up shop on North Halsted in 1974. It should be not gone without mentioning that Miller's masterpiece, the Glasner Studio, is on Wells Street and was started in 1928 as a second art colony in just up the street from the Carl Street Studios. And it's a really interesting site because there are, in the Kogen-Miller Studios, 8 original studio units. I believe there were about 15 in the Carl Street Studios. But in the Kogen-Miller Studios, a patron named Rudolf Glasner sort of noticed what the young artists were doing and was so fascinated and captivated by their work that he actually asked to have his own sort of atelier salon built at the back of the lot at 1734 North Wells, which became known as Glasner Studio, and is still preserved to this day, and which Edgar Miller Legacy was giving tours until this unfortunate COVID crisis of this studio and many other Edgar Miller sites throughout Chicago. But what makes the Glasner studio so important is that for Miller, who had this wide-ranging talent and master of so many crafts, it's really his masterpiece of art, design, and architecture in one space. And we can only imagine the parties during the Prohibition era that Glasner threw for all the artists that were living just outside his doorstep. And here's just a photo to give you an idea of the scale of this home that Rudolf Glasner had commissioned. This is the top room where he would entertain, you know, guests. This is a contemporary photo, but I'm sure it looked very similar in the 1920s and 30s. Now, I did want to mention that, again, the Hyde Park art scene was interconnected with the Old Town art scene at that time. And the most prominent example of this is the apartments at 5132 South Blackstone, which we're starting to learn were very likely either an Edgar Miller project or Miller adjacent project. Most of the work we believe was done by his apprentice, Jesus Torres, who we also are learning lived at the building for some time. Torres came to Chicago in 1926 and grew to prominence in the 1930s in many ways because of his association with Edgar Miller and the training that he received from him. But he went on to do many interior jobs and was a master craftsman himself. Unfortunately died at a young age of, I believe it was 49 when he died of cancer in 1950. But this home, I'm sure you may have walked by it before and wondered what's going on with that. That middle stairwell you see right between the two structures, the two buildings, is filled with a carved staircase, which you can see at the bottom left a photo of. And you can see that the studios are very much designed in the same way reimagined artist studios of the Carl Street studios. So finally, just to conclude, I think it's really important to also keep in mind that this art colony movement that took many different, you know, paths through Chicago's history was also mirroring larger movements in the world of art and design and even urban planning, which of course we know Chicago was very important in doing. Miller, his studios and apartments were for those part highly influenced by Alfonso Iannelli, the architect Barry Byrne, and the architect Andrew Robori, who were all leading modernists in the architecture fields that Miller worked with and learned from. And in the Edgar Miller Kogen story, it was really a great partnership between the two of them, where you had a developer, Kogen, who wanted to really do these big idea art colonies, with Miller being the artist and designer who could make it happen. These are just some few more pictures here. On the top right are the Frank Fisher studios, which were actually just apartments, but they were modeled after Edgar Miller's art colonies in Old Town. On the bottom right, I'm sure you recognize the St. Thomas the Apostle Church down in Hyde Park. That was designed by Barry Byrne with ornamentation by Alfonso Iannelli. And according to our research, Edgar Miller even did the actual execution of all those spindles up at the top there. In the center, just one more building, is Andrew Robori's Florsheim Mansion, which is in the Gold Coast, just up the street from the building at the top right. You can see a distinct similarity between the two. That was actually Robori's home until it became the home of the Florsheim family. And Miller also worked on that building. So much was going on with all these different artists, designers, and architects working together. And you have to wonder, if it were not for these art colonies that brought them together, you know, how much of a artistic explosion would have happened in Chicago. So thank you, and I think we can take some questions now.
All right. Thank you very much, Zach. If you want to stop sharing your screen, we can let everybody else in, and we'll take some questions. I have to admit, I had read through the book, but never got quite such a sense of not only the origins of the Chicago artist colonies, but the breadth of them throughout the city and their influence. So, questions, anybody? This has been one of the more impressive presentations we've had at our book club.
Yes, it was lovely.
Thank you.
You wrote this book a while ago. It was just came out, but how about currently now? What can you say about the art colonies now in Chicago?
Well, actually, I wrote it about 2 years ago. It was published last year.
Right.
But the book doesn't really discuss art colonies beyond the 1940s. That was primarily due to conditions imposed upon me by the publisher, who gave me page limits. But at any rate, there is an art colony in Lake Forest it's called Ragdale. It is the former home of Howard Van Doren Shaw, and it's a wonderful institution. It has been around since the 1960s, I believe, or early 70s, and they invite 15 to 20 fellows, artists, to come in and stay in various periods of length. I think a few weeks to a few months, and they live in this old mansion, and they dine together, and they are assigned different spaces, and there are various different buildings on the property, and it's a way of giving people time and space to get works done in a collection of other artists. And they meet together each meal, and they discuss whatever they want to discuss. And it's a continuation of the old idea of the artist colony. In Chicago, there are certain communities that have collections of artists loosely where they're close by. There are, correct me if I'm wrong, Zach, are there any actual buildings devoted to artists now that we haven't discussed?
Well, the only thing that I would bring up, which actually isn't that far from you all in Hyde Park, is the art. There's actually 2 new art colonies that have recently been established. One near the Dorchester Apartments off of Coney, I believe it's off Coney Island, Stony Island.
Stony Island.
Yeah, we're a long way from Coney Island. Stony Island. And then there are some new artist colonies also down at the Pullman National Historic Area. So I haven't been following exactly how those work, but one of them, I believe, is University of Chicago sponsored. And the other one, I'm not sure how it's sponsored, but they've been both getting a lot of press. So something to look into if you're interested in current art colonies in Chicago.
Right. Well, isn't there in the Washington Park area, there's the incubator, the Astor Gates, and then
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. And then down on Stony Island, there's the Stony Island Bank, old Stony Island Bank building,
The State Bank.
which is another collective, something like that. We've been at least aware of both of those organizations.
Yeah.
So there's still apparently a very vibrant art colony.
I would just mention that the big difference between what I think they had back in the 19th century and early 20th century and today is that the ones today are highly organized and run by institutions. You know, the ones 100 years ago, for the most part, were established by the artists themselves, and you know, for that reason, probably didn't last as long as an institutionally, funded and organized art colony. But it's amazing that they established themselves at all.
Well, and probably were more interesting. That was a snide comment, I'm sorry. Anyway.
I think I saw that someone asked a question via message asking what my art interests. It's no longer on my screen, so I don't know I don't remember exactly what it said, but I think it said something about what my interest in art is, because I'm not an artist. As I said, I live at the Carl Street Studios, have for 21 years. I'm certainly interested in the arts. I do collect art. I do collect Frederick Milton Grant paintings. I mentioned him earlier in the presentation. He was a late Impressionist, American Impressionist artist, and I like he was a prominent colorist, so he has very jazz mad, vibrant color, and so I appreciate his sort of prettiness and the vibrant colors of his paintings. I also collect Edgar Miller, because since I live in a building designed by Edgar Miller. So.
Yes, Judy.
Yeah, can I just follow up? That was my question.
Oh, okay.
And so I think it's amazing that you only have a professional interest in art, and you were able to write this book on artist colonies. If I could just share that, I was really excited, as I'm sure many people. I'm not in Hyde Park, but I'm actually in a building that overlooks the trees studios. So I could see the top of it. And it was just absolutely amazing, to realize this. I had no, I'm not into I appreciate the arts, but I had no idea, about these artist colonies. So that was really exciting. And I guess I kind of have another question. Would you be able to say anything about how that transition went from, since I'm in, let's see, former Towertown, but now there's what is considered gallery neighborhood, I think. There's a lot of art galleries in the area.
Yeah, I think generally it's called the Near North Side, right? Nowadays, I think it's called the Near North Side.
Yeah, I'm in River North,
or
but
River North.
There's a lot of like galleries in the
Yeah.
area. So I'm just wondering if there was some kind of transition, between art colonies and what it's currently,
Yeah, the art galleries started populating that area, your area, in the ones that exist there now, starting in the 1970s, I think, mainly. Robert Henry Adams, who collected and sold early Chicago art, created a gallery there on Franklin, and there are several galleries now in that whole area. But I don't think there was a transition from the time of the 30s and 40s. I think there was a period of time when those buildings were still used for the commercial and manufacturing purposes that they were built for. Up through the 60s, probably.
But I found it
Yes,
exciting.
Diane?
I was curious. I know that the Fine Arts Building does have a lot of sort of artsy stuff in it, including the Studebaker Theater and another theater. How much of it is still an arts incubator of one kind or another?
Yeah, the whole building still is what I would call an art colony. There are fewer artists themselves who may or may not, they may not be able to afford the rent. There are more art-related organizations, but there are still artists. There are several music-related organizations. In fact, one of my favorite things to do at lunchtime is to go down to the Fine Arts Building, go to the 10th floor, take the elevator, which is the only elevator in Chicago that's still manned by an elevator person, and they take you up to the top floor, and then you walk through the halls, and you look at the different art you know, art-related organizations. They have plaques showing some of these earliest artists, showing who occupied some of these studios. And then they will have carved doors and fantastic pieces of art that's still on the walls, painted by those original artists. And as you walk down the stairs and you check out each floor, someone's singing an aria from Verdi, or someone's playing a Liszt sonata. And, you know, it's just a fantastic way to spend an hour. It's just wonderful. But the whole building is still relating to the arts. The tenants are still art-related organizations or artists or music instrument manufacturers, very fine instrument manufacturers. The DAR was the original tenant, and they're still there, the Daughters of the American Revolution. What's the book organization, Zach? The Caxton Club, I think, still has a representation there. So it still has a lot of, especially social organizations related to the arts and art organizations.
Oh, well, the Caxton Club was featured at one of our meetings several months ago for their book, the book, what was it called? Read in Chicago, or the Chicago by the Book. Chicago by the Book, yes.
Yeah, they were in that building in the beginning.
Yeah, right. Very interesting. I have a sort of off-the-wall question, which is there are a lot of murals in Hyde Park, some of them in various stages of disintegration. And I was just, and this is, as I said, off the wall because I have no idea if there's any connection. Was there any connection between some of that public art space and the artist colonies in Hyde Park that either one of you are aware of?
Are you talking about the murals that are on the train viaducts?
Yeah, basically.
I'm not aware. I'm not aware.
Okay.
Zach, do you know?
I don't know for sure. They may be made in some instances with the help of the Hyde Park Arts Center, which is another, we should have mentioned, another sort of artist colony, although it's an institution as well, and art center. So I don't know when those murals were made, but probably within the last 40 years.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
They're more recent. I was just curious about a transition. And yes, the Hyde Park Arts Center is a very fascinating story because they began back in the 30s, I think. And
Their earliest roots
populated.
Their earliest roots
Right,
were in the 57th Street studios, and then they migrated to a more dignified space, I think.
Well, yeah, there's mixed opinions about that, but they certainly jumped around on 57th Street for a while and then gradually moved north to where they are now. But anyway, another interesting Hyde Park art story. So
Maybe Keith can answer this. Has Carl Street Studio ever been on Open House Chicago?
It was just this last year, in last October. It was the first time. They hadn't asked us before, and we hadn't thought about it. And we had, I think we had 800 people come in, and it was a VIP, members only. That's what it was. It was members only, and also for the volunteers. So we had a pretty big crowd. Carl Street is there's a lot of art installations within the courtyards, and so we have to be somewhat careful about how many people we allow in at any given time. But yeah, we had quite a good showing last year.
yeah, it's a little bit sad that that's not happening this year. So,
Yeah.
Dottie, you had your hand up. Unmute yourself, Dottie.
There you
There's several small dance companies who also have, or who are also located in the Fine Arts Building. There's an Indian dance company I know of, for example.
Yeah, yeah. There's the youth I think the Chicago Youth Orchestra has offices there and rehearse. They use the one of the theaters downstairs to rehearse and other performing arts organizations. It's really interesting. People should go and check it out more than they do.
All right, well, any other questions?
Last question.
Yes, Tony?
Do you know who owns the Fine Arts Building these days?
Well, the Studebaker Company actually maintained ownership until, I believe, the 1960s. I think they maintained their ownership until that time, and then they finally unloaded it. I don't know who, what organization owns it now. That's an interesting question, though, and I hope whoever it is retains it as an art-centered building.
Well, if they've had it since the 60s, apparently they aren't ready to unload it, so.
Yeah, there's a wonderful bookstore in there. I mean, not that Hyde Parkers need any more bookstores; they have some of the best in the world. But there is a really interesting bookstore called The Dial, which was a magazine that was published out of the Fine Arts Building until it went defunct in 1929, and they have a good old Chicago section, old Chicago section. It's a nice bookstore. Not 57th Street Books or the Co-op, but
The
it's
Cemetery Co-op.
yeah, for downtown. It's good enough for downtown.
All
There's,
right.
there's
So
also,
Mary Jo, I see you coming in. You have a
yes, I was
question?
going to say also there's performers music in the Fine Arts Building. It's an old music shop to shop for music for different
Oh
instruments.
yes, that's right.
It's a beautiful-
Sheet music. That's right. Mhm.
Yes.
It's been there for a very long time.
Yes, I was going to ask if the Bug House, when you talk about the Bug House squares, are the debates still going on, did you say? Do they still have some?
Yeah, they do an annual Bughouse Square Festival. I think it was just a month ago. And they did do something online this year, but normally they recreate the soapbox oratory performances for a whole day in the park, and they do all kinds of other little activities for families and others, but it's a very intellectual, performative, artistic anniversary they kind of do. Obviously, they don't still have daily, as it was 100 years ago. But I think that's sponsored by the Newberry Library. So I'm not sure if someone else.
Yeah, it's the Newberry, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's at the same time that they have their annual book sale.
Right.
I hear that.
Yeah.
All right.
It's
Anybody else?
Well,
Diane?
We had fun. I'm speaking for Zach. He can speak for himself, but I had fun.
Thank you.
Well, we were delighted that you could join us, and your presentation was phenomenal. I have recorded this session, so maybe we can post it up on our website if either one of you has no objections.
No objection.
Because it was a really comprehensive and thoroughly well done, and I think everybody enjoyed it. We had a good crowd for our book club. We had at one point over 25 people on here. So anyway, thank you both very much. It's been a great pleasure meeting you, and a great round of applause for the
Well, thank you.
presentation.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
All
Judy.
right.
Thank
Thank you all.
Shameless plug for Keith's book. If you don't have it, you
Yes.
should go buy a copy. And if
Right,
you,
at the Seminary Co-op bookstore.
yeah, go get it at the bookstore or order it. And if you are more interested in
Here it is.
later artist colonies, you can check out our website at edgarmiller.org. It's pretty easy to remember. So please learn more. There's so much more to the story.
And let me continue the plug. Zach's organization, Edgar Miller Legacy, has periodic lectures and seminars and events that are always fun and very informative. And and they're not just about Edgar Miller. They connect with other related topics in very interesting ways. So thank you very much for having us.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and good night, all. And we'll see you a month from now.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
It's interesting that I didn't need to read the book.